Right. Okay.
Good news. Good news. Good news.
This is Talk Radio.
The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Time to say very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Very good morning to you too.
Now, I suppose we could start in a sort of revolutionary way and talk about Julian Assange, who appears to have got a little bit of a break this morning, just before we started talking at the High Court.
Yes, it is good news, isn't it? It certainly means that the prospects of him being shoved into some dungeon in the United States in the near future is pushed back towards the horizon. And one could only hope that now that we have a Supreme Court, not an idea I was ever particularly keen on, that they might show some independence from the general attempt to enforce an extradition treaty, which I think almost everybody regards as unfair in itself and is completely wrong in this case, because it's clearly a political offence that's being pursued, which even the extradition treaty in all its non-glory prevents from happening. One can only hope. It has to be better than him being refused the right to appeal to the Supreme Court.
Yes, absolutely right. So we shall follow it with interest. But I mean, presumably he's still incarcerated, which is something you've talked about before.
He's horribly incarcerated.
Why?
This is what no one will really say. I mean, he's in a maximum security prison, and I'm not suggesting that they should put him in an open prison. After all, he has got this history of jumping bail. But which is one of the reasons why he's in prison at all. But that doesn't mean he has to be in the more or less the toughest and most restrictive conditions in the British prison system. And there have to be places where he could be securely held, where he didn't have to undergo what he undergoes there, especially a man in the state of health that he is said by his supporters to be in. It seems to me to be a misuse of the prison system. Liberals always say that people are not sent to prison as punishment, but for punishment. The punishment is deprivation of liberty. They're not supposed to suffer particularly while they're there. And you've probably seen this rather good new prison drama on Channel 4. It's obviously very politically correct, but it has a lot of accuracy.
Yes. I haven't actually. I saw you giving it a thumbs up last week, but I haven't actually watched it.
But the main prison officer, when she greets the prisoners on arrival, says, I don't care what you've done, it's what you do here that bothers me. Right. I think that's supposed to be the attitude. Well, Julian Assange has not actually been convicted of an offence. He's a civil prisoner, as I understand. And really he should therefore be in quite relaxed conditions and probably able to have things like his own meals sent in and much better visiting circumstances. But because it's Belmarsh, he's treated really very severely indeed. And I think it's becoming, as it drags on, an act of oppression in itself.
Right.
And I think
it's not really. I mean, I'm no fan of his, as you know, but I mean, equally,
nor am I.
Equally, his continued incarceration is all down to the slow wheels of justice, isn't it? It's nothing else really than that.
Well, yeah, but also, as I say, there are many different sorts of prison in our prison system, and Belmarsh is among the hardest to endure, and I just don't see why he should be there.
No, quite.
It's not a matter of liking him. I know I don't like him. By the time I encountered him, we didn't get on. But who cares about that? I back people against injustice, whether I like them or not.
Yes, well, as ever, Peter, you run against the tide in that case, because most people nowadays only support those people that they agree with. And actually,
there we are.
I mean, unfortunately, that is where we are. But speaking of which, you've now suddenly come down on the side of Mr. Boris Johnson, as you like me to call him, defending him. Imagine my shock to see you defending him at the weekend.
No, I have not come down on his side. I've come down against his enemies.
Yes.
It's a different thing.
Quite.
I have never, once you examine it, the old, much touted saw that my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Yes.
It's not true. My enemy's enemy can be my ally, because we're against the same thing, but it doesn't make him my friend. No, I still disapprove as heartily as ever of Al Johnson and of what he did, and of this government in general, which seems to me to be broadly a fairly left-wing government, the kind I don't like. But I see that the attack on him at the moment largely orchestrated by the BBC, which, as we know, is the Central Committee of the Liberal Revolution, is one which I have to oppose. And it was very, very sharply and clearly summed up, the nature of it, by this extraordinary tweet which the Labour Party put out, which I hope I gave quite a lot of publicity to.
Yes, you did.
This nurse, supposed to, I would imagine that they've got a real person. I mean, one hopes that they wouldn't invent a person, allegedly called Jenny, saying how she prevented a husband from seeing his dying wife for the general good. And I think that this sums up the problem that, although terrible as the Johnson government is, the useless opposition lying in wait to take over if he goes, and they will be the beneficiaries if he goes, is even worse. And it's most unwise for people to join in this pylon against Johnson, because the pylon only benefits Keir Starmer. And Keir Starmer's party puts out this tweet which appears to endorse what seems to me to be one of the most ruthless, zealous actions of the whole lot.
Well, what I found
how could you do that?
Well, like you, I found it astonishing that they thought that actually that was a good tweet to put out, because basically it showed how terrible Boris Johnson was, when in fact all it did was it showed how awful the individual nurse was.
Well, again, not awful. I had an aunt who was a nurse, and I still look back with admiration at her life, which was one of considerable courage and hard work and self-sacrifice and many other things. And I like nurses in general, though they're not what they were. And I can see how somebody who believed in the common good could be deluded into imagining that keeping a husband from seeing his dying wife was a good act. I don't want to attack her. Given the level of the fear propaganda which was going on at the time, it's understandable that somebody might be compelled. This is what happens to people. All the people who do the terrible things in utopias where in the end they turn into concentration camp states, they're all people who believe that they're doing good. The most terrifying sort of tyranny in the world is, as C.S. Lewis says, is the sort where the people in charge think they're doing you good. So surely that doesn't excuse the act, though, Peter, does it? No, it doesn't. The act is wrong. But this is part of the Christianity. You separate the act from the person. You can condemn the act without condemning the person. I think we should be as careful as we can to do that as much as possible.
Yes, but I think in the case of looking back at what went wrong and how we ended up where we are, and something that you railed against ever since the beginning of it, the lockdowns, the draconian measures that were put into place, I think we have to, at the very least, separate the act from the individual by all means, but we need to find who was the person that made that decision that was a good idea.
Well, the person who took the decision under an enormous amount of pressure at a time, and we remember this, when the country was in a frenzy of fear about a disease whose importance I still believe it greatly overestimated. And the government was actively engaged in spreading that fear and in getting people to be more and more afraid. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if that fear spread into NHS staff. After all, there they were in hospitals where they were seeing people who were obviously genuinely ill. They must have feared that this thing, given what the government was telling them, given what the modelers were telling them, they must have feared that this thing would become a general plague, slaying millions.
Yeah, and yet,
once you've got that idea in your head, you can turn to a husband and say, it doesn't matter whether you cry or beg or plead, I'm not letting you see your dying wife. I can imagine people doing that. It's not impossible. The crucial thing about the tweet is not that she did that, it's that the Labour Party puts this case into a tweet as what it believes to be part of an argument against the Johnson government. In fact, it's an argument against the Labour Party, because what they're doing is they are, I think, by picking this case, they're saying we actually endorse this sort of behaviour. They haven't, in all the time that this thing has been out and been attacked, they haven't at any time that I've yet seen said, oh, we didn't mean that, we didn't like what Jenny did. I think we can rather assume, given the stony-faced attitude they've had throughout the panic, that this is something which they would ultimately support. It is in their nature. They are zealots.
Yes, they are. And in fact, we know one thing about the Labour Party, in that they would have had the same exact regulations in place. In fact, the regulations might have been worse had they been in charge, because they always backed the same government regulations and restrictions, except they said they should have been made earlier and they should have been harder. And so,
longer.
Is it not possible, though, Peter, that there will be another beneficiary if Boris Johnson is removed, and that will be the Tory party and the country, because there's no chance, I don't think, that there's going to be a general election anytime soon. Keir Starmer, I don't think, would win it anyway. Surely we just get a better Prime Minister, don't we?
Well, you say that, but I'm not sure who it is you're referring to.
Well, I refer to anyone who will not be as bad as Boris Johnson, basically.
Well, okay. Again, I take your point. But the reason why Johnson became leader of the Conservative Party is because he had, and to some extent still retains, a certain magic. He appealed to people which the Conservative Party wouldn't normally appeal to. And look at them. Look at that range of extinct volcanoes called the Conservative Front Bench. Look at them. Who are they? Which of them would be more likely than him to defeat Sir Keir Starmer at the next election? Or my nightmare, the next election, actually the Tories will face a revived Blair creature.
Yes.
Sir Blair.
I mean, I think the interesting thing here is that one of Keir Starmer's strengths is that he's not Boris Johnson. If you put somebody else against him, he doesn't have that anymore. He doesn't occupy the moral high ground that Boris Johnson doesn't occupy, because everyone assumes now that he's just a liar and a twister and somebody who will do anything to save his own skin. If Keir Starmer's up against somebody equally, shall we say, high-minded, then he doesn't have the upper hand.
Yeah, but remember, Sir Keir does not have to win the next election. In fact, he almost certainly can't. He just has to win enough seats to form an alliance with Nicola Sturgeon.
God help us.
Well, you say that, and you will say that when it happens. But that's all he needs to do. And it wouldn't take much of a decline in the Tory vote for that to be the case. So, I say, you can be against a Starmer-Sturgeon coalition, or whatever they call it when it comes, without being a friend or defender or ally or liker of Al Johnson.
Yes.
So I'm not defending Al Johnson. I'm saying, watch out. If you toss Johnson in the dustbin, it may give you a huge sense of pleasure and delight to do so. But once he's in the dustbin, it may not be long before you see Keir Starmer cozying up to Nicola Sturgeon.
But are you not, though, Peter? Are you not now, Peter, guilty of a gross dereliction of your principles, though? Because you're now saying that a man who you have absolutely no time for, no respect for, who you don't think has done a very good job, and who is in fact responsible for some of the worst decisions ever made in the history of politics, should stay on. For how long?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's a dereliction of principle. What I've always said, or not always, but for about the past 250 years, I've said about the Conservative Party is that they're useless, and that there is no substantial difference between them and the Labour Party, and in some ways they're even worse, which I stick by. But in this specific instance, where what we have is basically an argument about whether the fanaticism and zealotry and authoritarianism of the COVID panic was good, or whether it's actually run its course, was probably a mistake and should be got rid of, then I think I have to be, at the very least, defend the second of those two courses against the first. And I think every sane person does, however much I loathe the Tories. I don't want to give strength and power and indeed office to a government containing two people who've been throughout this whole thing committed to being even more stringent, not merely burning down their own house to get rid of a wasp nest, but burning down everybody else's houses too. And that's what, Starmer and Sturgeon, look at the two of them. Throughout the whole thing, they've wanted more restrictions, longer restrictions, earlier restrictions, more devastating, damaging restrictions. This morning I saw that a favourite cafe of mine in Oxford had closed. And I know, because this has been in prospect for some time, I know that this is exactly because of these stupid restrictions which were imposed upon it. It was a thriving, happy business which people liked using and which was making its owners a good income, providing a service people wanted, and it's been killed. not like COVID, as the BBC would say, but by the stupidity of the restrictions imposed. And this isn't just one thing. There's hundreds, probably thousands of these instances all over the country. I'm sick of it and of all the other stuff. So if I'm faced with a political confrontation between the people who are still in favour of that sort of rubbish and someone who seems to be going off it, then what do you do?
No, I take that point. Stay where you are, though, because I want to talk about Russia coming up next. Peter Hitchens is here, Mail on Sunday columnist. Some very interesting words to say there about Boris Johnson and why he believes that he should not be removed. We'll take your calls on that as well, 0344 499 1000. Back with Peter Hitchens after this.
Talk Radio.
Answer the question. Fascination. Exasperation.
Welcome back to the Independent Republican Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. We're talking to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. He wrote at the weekend about Boris Johnson. Also wrote a little bit about Russia as well. Peter was stationed there. I know that's a rather old-fashioned word, Peter, but you were in Moscow for the Daily Express for quite a long time. You know a bit about the way the old Soviet Union operated and a bit about the mentality as well of Russia and its sort of what you might call satellite states, for want of a better word. I agree with you that much of this appears to be saber-rattling. But I suppose when you see the US and the UK removing embassy staff, it takes on a slightly more serious hue.
Well, it's a curious thing to do anyway. I think it's part of trying to create a public mood of danger and hostility in this. But I'm not sure what the point of this is or why any government, knowing anything about what war is like, would want to do anything to make a war, particularly in continental Europe, more likely than it is now. Such a thing, if it happened, would very likely spread. It would be economically catastrophic. It might even spread militarily into our own country. It would be devastating to the progress of mankind for years to come. And it would also be absolutely futile. And I'm astonished. The problem with this whole thing for me has been for some years that it's been an absolute handicap in any argument to know anything about the subject at all. Huge numbers of people now leap into it as if they understood it when they probably couldn't find Odessa on a map and know nothing of the history of Ukraine or the nature of the state or why the problem originated as it does or why Russia has any interest in this at all or why it should care. And in fact, the fundamental problem with this argument in many places where it's discussed in the West is absolutely no willingness to understand that Russia has interests. Now, you may not like Russia. You may imagine it's some country ruled by bears covered in snow where they have a funny alphabet. You think what you like about it, but it is a country with people in it and a long history and a culture and a foreign policy and a position which often gets invaded in living memory. Its second city was subjected to a starvation siege in which countless people starved to death. Foreign armies of incredible brutality swept deep into its countryside. This is in living memory, and these are not unique events. It's been going on for centuries. Therefore, it feels vulnerable and threatened when other powers move up close to its borders. You may think it's stupid for Russia to take this view. Think what you like. That is the view they take, and if you push and poke and probe and annoy, then they're likely to react. I published on Twitter today a favourite old cartoon of mine by Graham from the 1960s from Punch. There's a couple who are sitting on the top of a very tall bookcase in their sitting room with a dog snarling at the foot of it and all the furniture turned over, and the wife is saying to the husband, well, you have been rubbing him up the wrong way all evening. And basically that's what we do. We rub Russia up the wrong way now for nigh on 30 years, and we're surprised when we get a response. Well, it's just stupid. Right. And it doesn't, how can you possibly conduct diplomacy? And then some idiot comes on, oh, this is just like Munich in 1938. We're appeasing the Russians. Do they know anything at all?
I know. It is amazing, isn't it?
Has withdrawn from hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory in Central Asia and Europe since 1991. Not wholly non-violently, but certainly not much more violently than Britain withdrew from its empire. In fact, in some ways less, because they weren't responsible for things like the awful catastrophic partition of India, which we left behind, and they didn't do what we did in Kenya to the Kenyan people there. So it's not they've withdrawn. It is a withdrawing, shrinking country. It's not engaging in some gigantic, aggressive.
No.
It's Putin, we're told, is trying to recreate the Soviet Union. Well, he's not, you know.
No. Well, if anything, it's quite the reverse. He's kind of trying to resist the expansion of the European Union, isn't he? Because it was, it was Angela Merkel who first put Ukraine down as the next sort of domino to fall and become part of the EU.
Well, it was George W. Bush, that master of diplomacy, who began this back, I think, the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, when the idea was put forward of suggesting that Ukraine and Georgia should join NATO. And any fool could see that this is going to annoy and worry the Russians, who've been saying for years, why are you expanding NATO? Right. Who is this alliance against? NATO was set up, as Lord Ismay notably said, to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. But that was in the days of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is gone. And having an alliance against the Soviet Union is like having an alliance against the Austro-Hungarian Empire or an alliance against the Ottoman Empire. These bodies don't exist anymore. Right. So why do we have this alliance against Russia when it no longer is the aggressive dominator of a huge part of territory right the way up to Helmstedt in the middle of Germany, which it was in my lifetime and yours? It doesn't make sense. And it's not surprising there. And the other, we did promise them. There's a huge archive at George Washington University in the American capital of the documents showing that Western statesmen promised Mikhail Gorbachev just before he fell from power, in fact, that NATO would not be expanded eastwards. They did this in return for his permission, which was very reluctantly given, to reunify Germany, the country which had, of course, mounted the most devastating invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. So he wasn't the only person who was worried about reunifying Germany, by the way. Margaret Thatcher and I think François Mitterrand were worried about it too. But he gave that huge concession from a Russian point of view in return for our promising that we wouldn't expand NATO. It wasn't just him who didn't want to expand it. George Kennan, who was the greatest anti-Soviet diplomat of the American State Department, who developed the whole theory of containment, actually said in, I think, 1997, that expanding NATO was the stupidest thing that the West could do. It would only cause trouble. And Yegor Gaidar, who's now idolized by many Westerners, one of the liberal Russians who we wish were in charge rather than Vladimir Putin, he actually approached the Canadian ambassador in 2004 in Moscow and said, please, will you try and tell your government, stop this nonsense of expanding NATO, it will only cause trouble. And yet it's complete orthodoxy in the West. There's no controversy or doubt about this as a policy. And if you say it's a stupid policy, but, you're a Putin apologist, or even more ludicrously, I'm told I'm some kind of communist fellow traveller, because half the world doesn't seem to realise that communism has fallen in Russia. It doesn't exist there anymore.
And they hate it there even more than everybody else does in other parts of the world. Peter, listen, we've got to run because we're running late. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday there, once again setting out his stall on the Russian situation, saying he doesn't believe that there will be a war. He doesn't understand why people are rattling sabres, both sides of the fence, by the way, both in Russia and here in the West, suggesting there might be. Doesn't make any sense to him. 0344 499 1000. We'll take more calls. We'll talk to Auntie Worrell Thompson coming up. Now, though, let's get some news headlines.
News